Hey there, and welcome to Momma Drama and Trauma. I'm your host, Jenny Kimmel, and today's episode isn't about proving anything. It isn't here to justify my truth. It's about finally living what I already know. This episode is honest because the truth is I am stepping into a season where I am no longer shaping myself around who is comfortable with my healing. I am no longer adjusting my truth to make sure I am still easy to love, still easy to accept, still easy to stay connected to. I am choosing to stay true to myself, even if that truth is not always liked, even if it is misunderstood, even if it changes the rooms I am allowed in. And that is not bitterness, that is not anger, that is clarity. This year is not about becoming someone new. It's about becoming the woman I was always meant to be, without pretending, without shrinking, without explaining. This isn't me changing who I am. This is me becoming honest. And today, I want to talk about the versions of me that I am no longer willing to be. The versions of me I am no longer available for. There was a version of me who believed love was something you earned by being agreeable, by staying soft when something hurt, by being the one who always understood, by being the one who always smoothed things over. She learned early that being easy made you lovable, that being flexible made you safe, that being quiet made you acceptable. She didn't know how to listen to her body. She learned how to read rooms instead of checking in with herself, and that became second nature to her. She could feel tension before anyone spoke. She could sense disappointment before it was said out loud. She could tell when her presence was becoming inconvenient. So she would soften her tone. She would minimize her needs. She would quietly disappear inside herself just enough to keep everything smooth. Not because she didn't matter, but because she believed peace was something she had to earn. She did not learn how to ask for what she needed. She learned how to sense what everyone else needed first. And for a long time, she thought that was love. She thought loyalty meant bending. She thought commitment meant swallowing her own truth. She thought being a good woman meant making herself smaller so other people could stay comfortable. So she learned to explain herself gently. She learned to apologize even when she was hurting. She learned to carry guilt that was never hers to hold. She felt responsible for moods she didn't create. She felt accountable for dynamics she didn't design. She felt pressured to smooth things over when it wasn't her responsibility. And over time, that pressure became heavy. It became a constant low-grade tension in her body, a quiet tightness in her chest, a feeling of always being on, even when she was tired. She learned to take responsibility for emotional climates she didn't create. She learned to soothe tensions she didn't cause. She learned to make peace in spaces that were quietly asking her to disappear. She did this in her marriage. She did this in friendships. She did this in family dynamics. She did this in rooms where her voice mattered, but her comfort did not. And at first, shrinking felt like safety. It felt like stability. It felt like keeping things together. It felt like being the strong one. But slowly, quietly, it became exhausting. Exhausting in a way that sleep could not fix. Exhausting in a way rest could not reach. It was the exhaustion of constantly leaving parts of yourself behind. The exhaustion of always being halfway present in your own life. Not because she was weak, but because she was tired of leaving herself behind. There comes a point in healing where you realize you cannot keep calling abandonment love, where you realize you cannot keep calling silence peace, where you realize you cannot keep calling self-betrayal being understanding. Your body starts to speak before your mind does. You feel tight. You feel braced. You feel like you are always preparing instead of living. Your nervous system never truly rests in places where your truth feels like an inconvenience. Your heart never fully opens in spaces where you are loved more for your compliance than your honesty. And that's where I found myself, standing at the edge of my own life and realizing I wanted to step fully into it. Not as a version that felt safer to others, but as a version that finally felt honest to me. Not dramatic, not reactive, but awake. Awake to the cost of shrinking. Awake to the cost of staying quiet. Awake to the cost of being easy. I realized I was no longer willing to be the woman who changes herself to be accepted. I was no longer willing to be the woman who carries emotional weight that is not hers to carry. I was no longer willing to be the woman who explains her pain in smaller pieces so it will be easier to digest. Because peace that requires your silence is not peace. And love that asks you to disappear is not love. What I am choosing now is different. I'm choosing clarity over comfort. I'm choosing honesty over approval. I'm choosing self-trust over self-abandonment. And that isn't me changing who I am. It is me becoming whole. I am no longer available for the versions of me that survive by shrinking. I'm choosing the version of me who finally stands in her truth. The moment I stopped negotiating myself, there wasn't one dramatic moment where everything changed. There wasn't a speech. There wasn't a confrontation that suddenly fixed everything. There wasn't a clean ending that made it easy to let go. What changed was quieter than that. It was the slow realization that I had been negotiating myself for a long time. Not in obvious ways, in small daily ways, in the way I chose my words, in the way I swallowed reactions, in the way I explained feelings so they would land softer, in the way I questioned my own needs before honoring them. I started noticing how often I paused before speaking. That pause wasn't calm. It wasn't thoughtful. It was protective. It was my body checking the room before my heart could speak. It was my nervous system asking, will this be safe? Will this be allowed? And most of the time, the answer felt uncertain. I noticed how often I felt guilty for needing rest, how often I apologized for emotions that made sense, how often I asked myself if I was being too much before asking if I was being true. And slowly, that awareness began to change me, not into someone angry, not into someone bitter, but into someone awake. I realized that I had learned to survive by becoming smaller, by becoming flexible, by becoming understanding, by becoming quiet. Those patterns once protected me. They once helped me get through seasons where I did not feel safe to be fully seen. They protected me in seasons where I felt unseen. They protected me in seasons where being quiet felt safer than being honest. They protected me in seasons where keeping the peace felt more important than keeping myself. But seasons are not meant to last forever, and survival patterns are not meant to become your permanent personality. They are meant to be released when the danger has passed. And at some point, I realized that the danger was no longer outside of me. It was inside of me. It was the way my shoulders were always lifted, the way my breath was always shallow, the way my body never fully rested, even in quiet moments. My body was still living in yesterday while my life had already moved forward. It was the way I was still shrinking long after I no longer had to. It was the way I was still bracing even when there was no longer a reason to. It was the way I was still living like I needed permission to exist. I realized I had outgrown the version of me that was always scanning rooms instead of checking in with her own heart. I had outgrown the version of me that measured safety by other people's comfort. I had outgrown the version of me that thought being chosen meant being quiet. And I could feel it in my body. I felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. I felt heavy in a way rest could not touch. I felt disconnected from myself even when my life looked full. My body was asking me to choose myself before my mind was ready to. And slowly, gently, I began to listen. I began listening to my body before my fears. I began listening to my breath before my doubt. I began listening to what felt steady instead of what felt familiar. I began to pause less before speaking. I began to sit with discomfort without rushing to smooth it. I began to trust my own truth without rehearsing it. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. I stopped negotiating my needs. I stopped shrinking my emotions. I stopped apologizing for being real. And the more I did, the more I realized something simple and powerful. My peace did not grow when I became quieter. It grew when I became more honest with myself. My safety did not come from being easy. It came from being true. My healing did not deepen when I performed. It deepened when I started being real, and that was the beginning of becoming me. What changed when I stopped shrinking? When I stopped negotiating myself, everything around me began to shift. It felt subtle at first, not dramatic, not obvious, just a quiet sense that the ground under my feet was no longer moving the same way it used to. I felt steadier inside my own body, even when my life was still changing around me. Not because I demanded anything, not because I confronted everyone, not because I suddenly became louder, but because my energy changed. I stopped rushing to explain. I stopped over-clarifying my feelings. I stopped justifying my boundaries. I realized that my explanations had become another way of shrinking. Another way of asking permission to exist. Another way of making my truth smaller so it would fit more comfortably into other people's expectations. And some people noticed. Some relationships softened. Some grew quieter. Some became unfamiliar. Not because I became unkind, but because I became honest. When you stop shrinking, you stop being predictable, and not everyone is comfortable with that. I began to feel the difference in my body first. My shoulders were not as tight, my chest did not feel as braced, my breath did not feel as shallow. I was not constantly preparing for reactions anymore. I was present instead of rehearsed. I was grounded instead of guarded, and that changed how I showed up everywhere. I stopped apologizing before speaking. I stopped taking responsibility for emotions that were not mine. I stopped trying to make things feel okay when they were not okay for me. I started letting silence exist. I started letting discomfort sit. I started trusting that my truth did not need to be softened to be valid. Some people leaned in, they asked deeper questions, they listened differently. Others leaned away, not because I had hurt them, not because I had changed who I was, but because I was no longer offering the version of me that kept everything smooth. They grew distant, they became quieter in my life, and that was hard. Hard in a quiet way, hard in private ways, in the way your chest tightens when you realize something you loved can no longer come with you. In the way grief can exist even when you know you are choosing what is right. Because part of healing is grieving the versions of connection that only existed when you were smaller. It is grieving relationships that felt safe only when you were quiet. It is grieving the illusion that love and self-abandonment can coexist. There is a tender kind of sadness that comes with realizing that some connections were built around your silence, and you have to let that grief move through you without turning it into guilt. Because grief does not mean you did something wrong. It means you outgrew something that could not grow with you. I also began to notice what felt different inside me. I felt steadier. I felt clearer. I felt less reactive and more rooted. My peace stopped feeling fragile. It stopped feeling like something that could be taken from me with one wrong conversation. It became something that lived inside me. I trusted my number. I trusted my yes. I trusted my pauses. I trusted my truth. And slowly, my life began to feel like it belonged to me again. Not louder, not harder, but truer. Building a life that no longer requires me to shrink. Once I stopped shrinking, I started noticing something quietly powerful. It felt like a deep exhale that had been waiting in my body for years, like my nervous system was finally realizing it did not have to stay braced, like my body was slowly learning what safety actually feels like. My life began to feel lighter, not because everything suddenly became easy, not because all the hard parts disappeared, but because I was no longer carrying the extra weight of self-betrayal. I could feel the difference in the way I slept, in the way my breath moved, in the way my chest no longer felt constantly tight. It wasn't loud, but it was life-changing. I was no longer bracing myself before conversations. I was no longer rehearsing my truth in my head. I was no longer scanning rooms to decide how much of myself I was allowed to bring in. I began building my days around how my nervous system actually feels instead of how my old survival patterns were wired. I began choosing rest without guilt. I began choosing space without explanation. I began choosing honesty without apology, not in confrontational ways, not in defensive ways, but in steady ways. In the way I said what I meant the first time. In the way I trusted my no without over-explaining. In the way I let silence exist without filling it with nervous words. And that changed everything. I stopped forcing connections that drain me. I stopped answering emotional demands that were not mine to carry. I stopped saying yes to things that quietly asked me to disappear. I started asking myself simple questions. Does this feel steady? Does this feel honest? Does this feel like peace or pressure? And slowly, those questions became my compass. They became the way I decided who had access to my energy. They became the way I decided where my time was allowed to go. They became the way I decided what I was no longer available for. My calendar changed, my routines changed, my relationships changed, my inner world changed. I created space in my life where my breath could finally deepen, where my shoulders could finally drop, where my nervous system could finally exhale. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to other people. I stopped measuring my safety by how agreeable I could be. I started measuring my life by how aligned I felt inside my own body. I began honoring my no without over-explaining. I began trusting my yes without hesitation. I allowed silence to exist without rushing to fill it. I allowed distance to exist without turning it into guilt. I allowed myself to be misunderstood without chasing clarity. And that wasn't easy. Because healing sometimes means letting people believe stories about you that are not true. But peace is not built on being perfectly understood. It is built on being deeply aligned. And alignment has changed the way I live. My mornings feel calmer. My decisions feel clearer. My boundaries feel steadier. My life no longer feels like something I am performing for. It feels like something I am actually living. And that is what becoming me really means. Not louder, not harder, but truer. The bravest choice I have ever made. There is a quiet moment in healing that no one prepares you for. It is the moment you realize you are finally living your life for you. And that realization can feel unsettling at first, because for so long, your life may have been shaped around responsibility, expectation, and survival. Around what needed to be done, around who needed you, around who you needed to stay connected to. Choosing yourself after that does not feel loud. It feels unfamiliar. Not in a selfish way, not in a reckless way, but in an honest way. It is the moment you stop asking who will approve. The moment you stop calculating who might be uncomfortable. The moment you stop negotiating your peace for permission. And for me, this has been the bravest choice I have ever made. Braver than staying quiet, braver than holding everything together, braver than continuing to live a life that looked fine on the outside but felt hollow on the inside. Because this choice required me to trust myself in ways I never had before. Not surviving, not rebuilding, not being left, but choosing myself. Choosing myself even when it felt uncomfortable. Choosing myself even when it meant standing alone in moments I used to avoid. Choosing myself even when there was no guarantee of how things would unfold. Because living for yourself requires something deeper than courage. It requires trust. Trust that your truth is enough. Trust that your needs matter. Trust that your life belongs to you. It requires the willingness to disappoint people who benefited from your silence. It requires the strength to be misunderstood without explaining. It requires the steadiness to walk away from rooms that only knew you when you were smaller. Living for yourself means choosing your own alignment even when no one claps. Even when it changes relationships, even when it shifts your identity. And that can feel lonely at first. Lonely in the way that comes from no longer abandoning yourself for company. Lonely in the way that happens when you stop filling silence with noise. Lonely in the way that precedes deep connection with yourself first. Because there is grief in releasing the versions of you that were built for survival. There is sadness in letting go of the person who made everything smoother, easier, quieter. Because that version of you worked hard. She carried a lot. She did what she thought she had to do to survive. And she deserves compassion as you release her. But there is also freedom. Freedom in waking up and feeling grounded instead of braced. Freedom in knowing your life belongs to you. Freedom in trusting that you no longer need to disappear to be loved. There is room to breathe. There is peace. There is a steady sense of self that finally feels like home. I want you to hear this if you are listening today and you feel like you are disappearing inside your life. If you feel like you've been holding parts of yourself back. If you feel like you are carrying weight that was never yours to hold. If you feel like you are quieting your truth to keep the peace. You are not broken. You are waking up. And the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. Not loudly, not angrily, but honestly. You are allowed to live your life for you. You are allowed to build a life that feels like your own. You are allowed to be true to yourself even when it feels uncomfortable. And when you are not losing yourself. You are finally coming home. If this episode stirred something in you, I want you to pause for a moment, not to analyze it, not to explain it, just to notice it. Notice where your body feels tight. Notice where your breath feels shallow. Notice where you might still be holding yourself smaller than you need to be. Take a slow breath in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let your body remember that you are safe right now. Before I close, I want to share something really honest. There was a time in my life back when I was married that if I had heard this, I would have thought, I can't do that. What will people think of me? I was so aware of being judged, so careful about being seen, so cautious about taking up space. If I was tired, I didn't feel safe resting. If I needed space, I didn't feel safe taking it. And I didn't even realize I was living that way at the time. So if this feels hard to hear, if part of you feels resistance or fear around choosing yourself, you are not wrong. You are becoming aware. This week, choose one moment to be honest with yourself. Say no without explaining. Rest without guilt. Speak one truth without shrinking it. And if you feel ready, I invite you to share this episode with someone who might need permission to choose herself too. You never know who needs to hear that they are allowed to live their life for themselves, because your peace deserves to be protected and your life deserves to feel like your own. If you feel like you've been holding parts of yourself back, this space is for you. You can find Momma Drama and Trauma on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I'd love to stay connected with you there. As always, you are strong, you are worthy, and your story matters. Until next time, take care of you.